physics from Cornell and earned a Ph.D. in physics from Harvard as well. And he's a professor at Durham University and also the author of Chasing Proof, Finding Faith. So, Dr. Rudelius, let's just start out with you giving your testimony. Walk us through you growing up in a non-religious home, your perspective before religion, as well as the influence of your twin brother and his sort of existential crisis, and how that inspired you to come to the faith as well.
Yeah. So first of all, Devin, thanks a lot for having me on here. It's a great pleasure to be with you. So I grew up in a very loving, but also very non-religious family. So, growing up, my brother Steve and I never went to church. We never read the Bible. Most of what we knew about religion came from cartoons. So it was, So I guess growing up, it was sort of just, I figured that the point of religion was to help people to be happy and to live more moral lives. And I always felt that I was a pretty happy person. And I always felt that I had good sources of morality, good mentors in between my parents and my teachers. That religion just didn't seem like it was something that was all that important. I guess, the big things started to happen in our lives our freshman year of college. So Steve, again, my twin brother, went to Northwestern. I went to Cornell. And his first year there, he met a guy on his floor named Matt, who was probably the first really serious and thinking Christian that either of us had ever known. So Steve and Matt started talking, and Steve, you mentioned this sort of existential crisis that he'd been going in for a few months leading up to college, which was all of a sudden he just started having like these obsessive thoughts about death. Like he just realized that, hey, like someday I'm going to die and that's going to be the end of me. And like, why isn't everybody else as bothered about this as I am? So he was just thinking about this every day. He never talked about it with me, never really talked about it with anyone. But all of a sudden, he went off to college thinking with this idea that, there isn't really any hope of life after death. All the religion just seemed sort of foolish to him and outdated. But then he met this guy, Matt, who was like a really smart guy. He was studying engineering at Northwestern. And yet he like actually really believed that God exists and that that there is an afterlife, right? That heaven exists. So this is a big deal for Steve. And so it's kind of like, he would really like there to be something more to this world, but at the same time, he just hasn't really seen, convincing evidence. But he also kind of realizes, and this is true for both of us, is that neither of us really ever studied the evidence. Our views of religion, as I said, had come largely from cartoons, and we'd sort of just internalized this idea that, that there was no evidence for God, that that religion and science are sort of at odds with one another. And so for him, this was the beginning of this period of discovery, talking with Matt, talking with some other guys, some Christians who knew a lot about faith and the Bible and religion. He started going to church. And so to make a long story short, he eventually decided to become a Christian. And so it was about at this point that he started talking about it with me. And at first I was pretty hesitant to the idea of faith. As I said, for me, I wasn't having this big existential crisis. I was mainly concerned about school and sports. And that's kind of what my life revolved around. And so when he tried to give me a copy of the Bible and some other books about Christianity to read, I told him, look, Steve, I have trouble finding time to read books that I want to read, much less time to read books that I don't want to read. That's just where I was with it. It just didn't seem like it was all that important to me. But I started reading, going to church with Steve, actually, when we were both home over the summer, and just started having conversations with him. And so I started on my own journey of understanding, what are the arguments for and against the existence of God? Does God exist? Did Jesus rise from the dead? And over time, I started to find myself becoming more convinced that there was something to this, that it seemed quite reasonable. but there was still this personal sort of thing holding me back. Of is this really the sort of thing that I want to completely change my life around for? As I said, I'm pretty happy. I feel like I'm a pretty moral person. And I remember having this conversation with Steve where we got this argument about the question of are people mostly good? And my view was that sure, there are like the Hitlers of the world out there, like these really terrible people, but for the most part, we're all just like good. We're just good people trying to do our best. And Steve tried to say, like no, actually, like people are sinful. People are in need of forgiveness and redemption. And that didn't really resonate with me, I guess. So even if I could start to acknowledge some of the arguments for the existence of God and for some of the key parts of Christianity, the whole message just still didn't really resonate with me to the point that I wanted to give my life to it. So I guess this is where kind of the like most dramatic part of my story and in my book comes in, which is I applied for some internships after my sophomore year of college, and I got a conditional offer from the National Security Agency contingent upon completing a polygraph. So I went into this polygraph sort of approaching it roughly the same way that I thought about heaven and the afterlife, which is, hey, if there's a heaven, I'm sure I'm a good person. I'm basically a good person. I'm sure I'll be fine. And same thing here. It's like, hey, I haven't done anything seriously wrong. I'm basically a good kid. I'm sure I'll be fine. But I went in, started taking this test, and like many other people who have taken such polygraphs, realized pretty quickly that I was going to fail, not only if I were lying, but just if I felt guilty about anything at all. I mean, a polygraph is colloquially known as a lie detector test, but in practice, right, it's measuring your sweat, it's measuring your breathing rate, it's measuring your heart rate. And what I found pretty quickly is that even if I'm hiding anything that I don't want to talk about, whether it's a lie or not, whether it's really important or not, just having that on my conscience was enough to make me start to react. So for about 4 hours, I shared everything I could think of that I'd done wrong in my life. And for the first time, I really came to face with this reality that my brother had been telling me, that we'd been arguing about. I'd always figured I was basically a good person, but as I started having to go into all these things, realized that deep down, there's a lot of things I've done that I'm not proud of, and deep down, I'm not as good of a person as I'd like to think I am, and probably that's not just me, right? Like it's not like I'm some really exceptionally terrible person. Like this is, I think, really what human nature is. If we just sort of have to confront ourselves and face who we really are, and so for me at that point, that's when the whole story that my brother had been telling me really made sense about how people are sinful, people are separated from God and in need of forgiveness. But then also, of course, the other half is that God loves us so much that he came and he died to forgive us. And so when the first half of that message made sense to me, I think the whole thing really made sense. Everything just sort of clicked. And so so for me, I would say that was sort of the moment of when that I became a Christian. At least that's the day that I attribute it to.
Sure.
But I think it's kind of, I think, something that's really looking back, it was really, I think it's striking how my brother and I came at it with very different needs. He was having these obsessive worries about death.
Yeah.
I all of a sudden was having to confront the fact that, hey, I'm not actually as good of a person as I'd like to think I am. But both of us kind of in the Christian gospel found sort of exactly the balm for the maladies that were afflicting us. That there was like this good news that sort of perfectly addressed both of what we needed.
Wow. Yeah. And how old were you at this time when you made that full conversion?
Yeah. I guess I was just a couple months short of turning 20. So in some ways pretty young, especially as I get older. It's like, wow, man, I was really young. But on the other hand, old enough to have really started to like think for myself about these sorts of issues.
Yeah. Is it just you and your brother and then your parents?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we're both married now. So growing families, but at the time, yeah, just my brother and me and our parents. Yeah.
Since you and brother converted almost at similar times, did that all inspire you guys or motivate you guys to try to like talk to your parents about it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, yeah, it did, and definitely so more. I'd say more so with my brother than me. Not just our parents, but we have a very close sort of extended family of aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents, and there were a lot of conversations that took place. So around the same time that my brother and I came to faith, our mom also started going to church once again. Like she and my dad sort of had both grown up, going to church, and then at some points in their adult lives just kind of stopped. Um, but sort of, and I'm not sure if it was related. I don't know. I've never really gotten all the details of why my mom started going to church again, but um, maybe it had something to do with my brother's conversion or mine or whatever. But yeah, so she's somehow she around this time sort of had a similar reawakening, I guess you could say, of her faith. Our dad, so our parents were split up and got divorced around this time, basically when we went off to college. So our dad was and is, I think, still more hesitant about faith. And what I found from a few conversations with him about faith is that it was just kind of hard to make progress. Where he, I guess, both of us sort of had these ideas, and we have our perspectives, and nothing really changed too much. But what I would definitely say to my dad's credit is that he's been incredibly accepting of the fact that we are, Christians. That my brother now works like in campus ministry full time, and I know, a number of other Christians who have worked in ministry whose Christian parents have been opposed to their working in ministry. It's like, oh, we put you through college so that you go out and make make a lot of money and have a really fancy job, not so that you could live doing like ministry, which I think is very sad. But I would say, like, our dad has been more supportive than a lot of those parents, and he doesn't even really buy into the sorts of things that my brother does. I think what really matters to him is the fact that we've found something that allows us to live a fulfilling life. So I would say, I'm really thankful for my dad, but it's like faith-wise, I would say there hasn't been a lot of progress in terms of being able to share our faith with him.
Yeah, sure. And I know that you were on Sean McDowell's show, and I know you mentioned that you had expressed doubts on there, but have you had any strong doubts of your faith recently? And if so, how did you kind of combat that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So so something I've talked about, I think maybe with Sean, but in a few of the interviews I've done, is, for me, in my experience, and this is something I talk again a lot about in my book, that my doubts have kind of fallen into two categories. Like, there's one that's just horrendous, devastating doubt, like faith crisis, having trouble getting out of bed, not sure if I can even call myself a Christian level of doubts. And it, fortunately, I would say that I have not had those in the last, recently, or even in the last few years. I think probably it was around, I don't know, 2021 or so was the last time that I had anything like that. And it took me a while to realize this, because I've had a few seasons like that, lasting anywhere from a couple weeks to 8 or 9 months. That what was really going on for me wasn't just intellectual doubt. It was actually anxiety. Some possibly could even say that it's some sort of religious OCD that is relatively common. But I think this was important for me to realize, because, in the words of a good and very intelligent friend of mine, in the face of those kind of doubts, what I really needed wasn't answers; it was treatment. Like, all the rational answers in the world aren't going to help me when my doubts are just totally irrational. When I'm just when my brain has been hijacked by these obsessive worries. That in those moments, what I really need to do is just get outside or go to the gym or go for a walk or something, right? And once I get to a place where I'm at a more more stable mentally, then maybe I can take a look at some of those arguments and start to rethink things, and that's usually when they'll start to look a lot clearer. Now the other type of doubt, so that's category A. As I say, I fortunately have not experienced those in a while. Category B is just sort of like always is just like the smaller sort of always lingering doubts, or maybe even questions is a better way to put it. Mysteries of the faith, things that are just hard to understand, things that to me seem to point against theism. And I think that those are the sorts of things that I've definitely just come to be able to live with, right? Like for me, the hard part is when somehow one of those things get switched into the first category and I start to like obsess over it. But I think that something, and maybe being a scientist, I think I can maybe draw in some expertise here that, there are lots of puzzles in science, like how did life begin and how did the universe begin? And like how does high temperature superconductivity work? How do galaxies form? All sorts of questions that we're just comfortable living with, that it's like, man, I really wish I had the answers to these questions. But just because I don't understand the answer to some question, it doesn't mean that it ruins the entire theory. It doesn't mean that it ruins the entire hypothesis. The fact that I don't understand how the universe came into being doesn't lead me to like question all of cosmology, right? And so I think the same thing is true with faith, where I can have these areas that, man, I wish I understood better, why there's so much evil and suffering, and I wish I understood better, how God's sovereignty fits with human free will and these sorts of things. But I think that I've come to a place where I can live with those mysteries, and I can say, I can still have those questions and still think that on the whole, the evidence points towards Christianity. On the whole, I can still live life as a Christian, of like praying and reading scripture and giving God my allegiance. That I can still do those things even with these questions.
Yeah, yeah. And I know also in your interview too, you said that because you're in the field of science and whatnot, that people in your field are usually pretty receptive towards your Christianity and whatnot. Have you found that those conversations actually come up often in terms of you guys discussing your worldviews and your religions with each other, whether it's either a worldview of atheism, someone's Muslim or Christian or whatnot? Do you guys ever have those conversations about them? Not like a debate or anything, but just
Yeah.
a pop.
Yeah. Sometimes. I mean, I would say I sort of wish that they happen more often. I think what I maybe see more often is discussions about various topics where you maybe start to see someone's worldview like coming into it a little bit and affecting how they see things. And so, yeah, I mean, I think I kind of, see evidence of people's worldviews a lot in these conversations. But what it's been what's harder for me sometimes is to kind of like bring the conversation back to the root of like, well, not only like what is different, but sort of why do people see things in different ways. I think that to me, I found that that's a really big part of my journey to Christianity, but even since then, in how I see faith. That like growing up, I always thought, people should be good people. We should be nice to each other. And at some point, as I was learning more about faith and religion, it's sort of like, well, why do I think that? Like why, where in my current like agnostic, atheistic worldview, like where do I see that the idea that say humans have value, that human rights should exist. And so I think that those are the sort of the like deeper questions are the ones that maybe are a little bit tougher to probe, and that I'm not always as good as I'd like to be, I guess I'd say. I like moving the conversation to those deeper questions.
Yeah, sure. And you also mentioned too that going back to the arguments for God, you said that the contingency argument for you was the most compelling.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'd say it's up there. I mean, I think that I would say that arguably, well, probably the three, and I would say probably the top one for me is like the evidence for the life, death, miracles, and resurrection of Jesus.
That's fair. Totally fair.
I think that number two, because I would also say that within there's a lot of smaller points, right? That we're kind of moving out of the realm of metaphysics and into the realm of history. And even though ancient history maybe isn't the most reliable source of truth, it's not like you can put it in a test tube. It's still, I think, to me, more reliable than like metaphysics and philosophy most of the time. So that, to me, is what I would say number one. Number two, I'd probably say the fine-tuning argument. Yeah. But contingency for me, I think, is the one that like puts God, if we're talking about like, who gets a seat at the table at this whole discussion, like, and I think that the contingency argument for me is the one that at least gets theism on the board. That I'm not sure from like this idea of contingency and things existing necessarily or contingently. Like, it's very confusing to me. I'm not sure if I understand it, but I would say that at least theism's answer to the question of why is there something rather than nothing? Why is the world the way that it is? I would say that theism has at least as good of an answer as anything else. And so for me, that's enough to sort of get it in a seat at the table where I can start to think through these other arguments. Yeah.
Is there an argument for God that you just never could buy into?
That I could never buy into? Well, I think that let me think. I mean, I would say that like with fine tuning, that there's sort of like two different classes of arguments. So the question of the world seems so perfectly designed for our existence, and I think like some people would try to use this as arguments against, say, evolution. And for me, I guess I have a bit more trouble with those sorts of arguments because I mean, I think that for me, the version of the fine-tuning argument that is pretty compelling, it isn't just looking locally at like the features of the Earth or the atmosphere, but looking from a larger perspective at the laws of nature in general, the laws of physics in general, because I mean, those do really need to be tuned quite remarkably in order to give rise to life. And I think that when it comes to some of the ones, with the Earth, being like just a perfect distance from the sun, one could more easily say, well, maybe that's just our planet. Maybe there's some other planets. Even if this one wasn't quite right, there could be other planets out there that could maybe do the trick. And so I think that. I don't know. I guess I feel like I'm sort of rambling here, but I think that there's a version, and I guess this is true for most arguments. I think there's a version of it that I find compelling, but then there are also maybe versions of it that I don't find as compelling.
Okay, cool. And I think you were talking about during the doubts question, you were saying how there's sort of these mysteries of faith at times. Do you also hold any type of maybe unpopular opinions about Christianity?
Interesting. Unpopular opinions about Christianity. Unpopular amongst whom, I guess, is like.
An example would be, for me personally, I think, although homosexuality, I totally agree is a sin, I think Christians as a whole weigh that more than other sins.
Okay, yeah, I see. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Well, I feel like there are a number of things. I mean, one that I guess I kind of already mentioned one, which is like evolution. That I think that first of all, let me say that like I think that on the whole question of like evolution or like young Earth creationism, whatever, is sort of like what you just said is maybe overblown in our culture. That I don't think that it's really the most important thing. I think really that what's really important is not how exactly God created our world, but simply that He created our world in the first place. And so I think that when it comes to evolution, like to me, I think that like the big difference between evolution and like some of the other versions of like instantaneous creation is that evolution proceeds in such a way that we humans like can actually appreciate it and understand it. And I think that that's something that that you actually kind of see a lot in the world, that like it's really remarkable actually that our night sky is transparent, right? So that like at night you can like see into these distant galaxies, right?
Yeah.
It's almost as if God has like designed us and designed our world not only that we exist, but also so that we can learn about it, so that we can study it, so that we can do science. Like there's so many ways that our world and our minds could have been different. It would make science just completely impossible. And so to me, I think that when it comes to evolution, it seems at least plausible to me that maybe God wants us to be able to appreciate it and to find beauty in it, the way that like lots of atheistic evolutionary biologists. You can hear Richard Dawkins talk about how beautiful he thinks that evolution is, and I guess my thought is, well, if he can think it's that beautiful, then maybe God thinks it's beautiful as well. That he would somehow take like from the dirt, from these cycles of even suffering and death, that somehow God would use that to build something greater.
Mhm.
I don't know. Yeah, I think that there are intelligent people out there who would think differently. So I'm not saying that any like intelligent Christian must feel the same way I do, but I think that's at least like a good possibility.
Sure. Well, then, from that vantage point too, and you as a scientist, if God came down and said you have one question to ask me, I'll answer it right now. What would you ask him?
Um, yeah, I mean, and well, I guess I could go one of two ways. One is I could ask him to explain all the physics that I work on a daily basis, so that I can just like go win a Nobel Prize or something. That would be pretty tempting. But I think thinking less like selfishly, I guess it would have to be something about evil and suffering. I think the aspect of the like problem of evil and suffering to me that I most that maybe bothers me most, or that I would most want to know about, is like how exactly does the afterlife work, and heaven and hell. I think C.S. Lewis kind of remarked on this too, that sort of like I can handle like a finite period of suffering and evil, like I can see how that works, but it's harder for me to believe this idea of hell, of like eternal judgment. So I think I'd like to understand better how that works. Like I think I have faith based in what I know of God, that He's good and just. But I'm not exactly always sure how that goodness and justice will work itself out in practice in the afterlife. So yeah, I guess I'd like to know more about the afterlife.
Sure. I don't blame it. That's a very, very, very tough topic and complex to understand. But then,
Yeah.
so you went on, like we mentioned before, you went on Sean McDowell's show. Sean McDowell is a pretty popular Christian apologist, has hundreds of thousands of subscribers on YouTube, and the video got quite a few views as well. Did you have any atheists or Christians reaching out to you after you did that interview, just picking your brain about your experiences, and maybe they had experiences as well that they can relate to it? Did they ask you any questions? Anyone reach out?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it's tough to know because I did a number of like a few interviews at the time, um, and I
Yeah.
also had my book come out before, not too
Mhm.
far before that. So I'm not always sure what people were responding to, but I did notice that I did indeed, after doing the Sean McDowell program, like see a bit of an uptick. So I think that there were some responses after that. Yeah, I mean, I sometimes like get just kind of encouraging emails from Christians saying, talking maybe about a similar experience that they've had, or just saying that they like appreciate the work that I'm doing. Um, I occasionally get emails from atheists, which I don't know. On the whole, I've been generally disappointed by, because they, at least the ones I've gotten, tend to just sort of want to try to like convince me that I'm stupid, basically, for believing what I do. And I I have yet to receive an email that I think has a really like cogent argument, or maybe more importantly, I've yet to receive an email that really has like a new argument. That
Yeah.
I got one a little while back saying, "Well, have you thought about the problem of evil and suffering?" And it's like, well, yeah, a lot. Like, has anyone not like worried about this? Um, or yeah. So yeah, I think what I really have appreciated the most and is I've gotten emails sometimes from like Christians, sometimes from atheists or skeptics who are just like legitimately curious about something, who just like maybe it's a Christian struggling with some question in their faith, or maybe it's like an atheist who's like kind of exploring, and or an agnostic or some non-Christian who's kind of exploring and just like wants to know about something that's bothered them. I like those questions a lot. Like I guess what I'm saying is that I really appreciate honest questions, and I obviously appreciate encouragement. I don't appreciate so much the like you're stupid and here's why sort of thing else.
Yeah. And as someone who obviously went through the whole thing of questioning your worldview, what advice would you give an agnostic or an atheist who's going through that same kind of road?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I would say that probably like the most important thing and maybe the most enjoyable thing is to not try to walk the road alone. Like I think that for me, it was really important that I had my brother like guiding me and giving me answers. Because something I realized very quickly was that like my caricature of what Christianity was and what Christians were like was very different from what it actually was in practice. And so actually having Christians, I think, and this is true for my brother, right? That he like met this Christian guy, and that Christian guy introduced him to some other guys, and so he could like ask them questions, not having to rely on just like what is what is like the internet say is what Christians think, but actually to be able to talk to someone about it. And for me, like having my brother and then going to church with him, I started to see that Christianity was a lot different, and experiencing it was different than just like reading about it. And as I say, I think it was also more enjoyable that way because I mean I found that in the process, my brother and I started being like brought closer than we were before. That in my family, as I say, it's a super loving, it's an awesome family, but it's also not a family that like tends to talk too much about deep questions or deep issues. And so a lot of these conversations with my brother, it's like the first time that we had really talked about stuff this deep, like and talking about like, hopes and dreams and like fears and these sorts of things. And I think that like, if you're like on that journey, I think it, as far as both in terms of like likelihood of coming to faith, but also like how much you'll enjoy the journey, I think it's really important to do it in the context of other people, and to find like a community of people that you know and trust who can walk along that path with you.
Gotcha. Cool. And since you're a scientist, I have to ask you this question because I've never gotten a chance to ask a scientist this question.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on aliens? Real? Not real? Extremely real?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that it seems very plausible to me, like scientifically, that there might exist other like species, like other aliens out there. I think it's unlikely that like I don't believe in like the UFO sightings and stuff or like whatever are like compelling evidence because, well, in part for one thing, I think there's definitely I mean a lot of these UFOs it like turns out later are like known to be like military planes or something like that, right?
Sure.
But also it seems likely to me that, or it seems unlikely to me that they're like these aliens just kind of like flying around in our atmosphere that somehow haven't been spotted in any other way, or in any other convincing way. And it's also, I think, quite unlikely that aliens would have. I mean, it seems unlikely they would have made it to us in the first place. So I think like maybe the sci-fi depiction of aliens, visiting Earth and like being here unknown, that maybe doesn't seem so likely to me. But the idea that aliens could exist in some other corner of the universe, that doesn't seem so outlandish. I think that C.S. Lewis had some like essay on this, and he kind of talked about like, well, if God could like visit our world and like have redemption here, then maybe that could also happen in other planets as well. So like, I think from a theological perspective, I'm not really bothered by the idea that there might exist aliens out there. from a scientific perspective, it seems plausible, but at the end of the day, like it's tough to really know, right? There's a lot of like unknowns that are in that equation.
Even a topic
I
you
don't know.
guys in the science community discuss ever?
Not like ever. And it's funny because you're not the first person to like ask me, uh, like in this sort of, in the context of like an interview or just like someone finds out I'm a scientist and is like, what do you think about aliens? I've like never once had it come up as a topic of conversation. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I thought that'd be
Yeah.
like
Sorry.
number
Sorry to
one.
disappoint. Sorry if that's disappointing. Yeah.
I thought you like a top 5 question. Like, what are your thoughts on alien? Okay, that's fair. That's fair
Yeah.
that you're okay. Fine, fine. And also, since you have a book, what was the greatest lesson you learned since I guess through that process of writing the book and since it's been out? Like, what's like the greatest lessons you've learned through that whole kind of process?
Yeah. I mean, I think I learned a lot first about like the process of writing a book, and I think the thing that I like mainly remember from the whole process is, there's a lot of back and forth with the editor and stuff where I'll send in a copy, a version of the manuscript, and they'll like mark it up, and sometimes they'll cut out like 40% of what I've just written, and and um, and what I found like time and time again is like I get back the edits and be like so upset that like something I worked so hard on is being just like thrown into the trash, um and so for like a few hours I'd like stew in anger and be like, this is terrible, I can't work under these conditions, and then I'd like calm down a bit and start to think about it again and be like, well, actually, maybe that's a good idea, And I think as I look back on where the book is now versus where it started, there were like huge improvements. And so like I feel like, yeah, I really got to give a lot of credit to my editor Dave and publisher Jan, that like they really, I think, made it a lot better. And so I think it was definitely like a lesson in humility, kind of like
Sure.
having to get over that like sense of like, this is like something I worked so hard on, and it's like, it's like it feels like they're throwing out a part of me, to being like, well, like these people are getting paid to like do this, they're like experts in this, and I'm not. I'm just like writing a book for the first time in a genre I've never tried to write before. So yeah, I think there was like a lesson in humility. I think something that's been cool too is, even from conversations like this and stuff, like I feel like I've gotten to like think again about my own story, because the book is a memoir, it's about my life, and so it's been kind of cool to hear like other people's thoughts on it, and to like some people have had kind of like insights and stuff that I never had. It's like, oh man, I wish I'd thought of that. I could have like written about it in the book, um, but yeah, I think it's been cool to like just be able to step back and kind of look at my whole life story and to see it in new ways.
How long is the process? Well, how long was the process between the first word you wrote on a piece of paper for the
Yeah.
book and it actually getting published? How long was that?
So it was actually really long, because long before like Tyndale, my publisher, approached me about writing the book, I had started to write the early chapters, just like thinking kind of like, I want to make sure I get these experiences written down, in the thought that maybe like someday I might want to write a book. And it's actually a good thing I did, because like 10 years later, when I was reading some of them, I was like, oh, I'd forgotten that happened. It's like, it's a good thing I wrote it down in the first place. So I think the very first words I started writing down were maybe like 2012, 2013 or something. But it wasn't until I think it was like the fall of 2021 that I like really like I got the book contract or whatever, and I really started writing. From there, it was like 8 months of it was my deadline, and so the vast majority of the first draft, probably 3/4 of it, got written in that time. A quarter had already kind of been written, and
Mhm.
then after that, it was another. I can't even remember. Probably another 8 months or so of like back and forth fixing things, before the like yeah, the final version got done.
Okay, cool. And speaking of books and that, do you have any current theologians or scientists you admire the work of, whether it's books,
Yeah,
articles, writings, maybe podcasts?
yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I'll mention a few books that, like, I guess along my at some point in my faith journey have been important for me. A couple of them I do mention in my book. The first book about Christianity that I ever read was called Letters from a Skeptic, that my brother gave to me along with a copy of the New Testament. And it's between a father, Edward Boyd, and his son, Gregory Boyd. And it's like an actual correspondence. So the father was an atheist, agnostic. The son was a pastor, actually. And so the book is just like the dad asks, these questions, says, here's why I have trouble. This is why I can't believe in God. And reading the dad's questions in his letters as a skeptic myself, I like really resonated with all of his questions. He's just like a normal guy asking normal questions. Why does God allow evil and suffering? How can a rational person believe in this or that, or miracles? And every time I'm reading it, it's like, man, this sounds like a good question. But every time I was surprised at the thoughtfulness of the son's responses. They weren't always convincing, but they always showed a lot of thought. That this Christian guy has clearly really thought about it a lot. And so, by the end of the book, the dad became a Christian. He like by the end of this correspondence, and I definitely felt myself as I read it, kind of drifting further that way as well. The Christianity was starting to make a lot more sense by the end of the book than at the beginning. So I thought that was a really good one. Some other books, I'll go more quickly. Scott McKnight's One Life is one that really sort of shaped how I think about the gospel, and it kind of gave me an expanded view of what the gospel is and what it means. A book that was really important when I was a grad student in science, like in shaping the way that I thought about science and faith, it's called Where the Conflict Really Lies by Alvin Plantinga. It's a bit more like on the philosophical side, like it's a bit technical in places and stuff. But for me, it was really, again, like helpful in shaping and helping me like come to see that there deep down, I think, is not a conflict between science and religious faith. And I guess the last one I'll mention, I feel like I could keep going, but The Prodigal God by Tim Keller, who sadly passed away not too long ago, is a book that I try to read like every couple of years. Again, really kind of like talking about the heart of the Christian faith. So yeah, I think those ones. Oh wait, one more is the Jesus Storybook Bible by Sally Lloyd Jones. Really amazing, not just a children's book, even though it's maybe officially marketed as a children's book. It's like a picture book about the Bible, and I think it's a really good one. So there you go, 5 quick books.
Awesome. I'm sorry, my intrusive thoughts are taking over. Do you watch any sci-fi movies ever?
I'm not the biggest fan of sci-fi. I'm getting into like fantasy a lot more, but carry on if you have thoughts or questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if you have any particular sci-fi movies or shows that you're really into.
Yeah, I know it's disappointing to people. Like you'd think that being like a physicist, I'd be like a huge sci-fi nerd, but I'm really not. Like I'm lately I've always been a really big sports nerd. I've lately been getting into fantasy, and especially since moving to England, I've been lately becoming a little bit of a World War II buff. But like sci-fi, I don't know. You need my dad here. My dad is like a huge sci-fi nerd, but I don't know. Maybe it like skips a generation or something.
Oh my gosh, you said England? Durham University is in England?
It is, yeah.
I thought it was in North Carolina.
You're not the first person to think that. Don't worry. Yeah. I am. I'm living here in England now. Yeah.
But you're still an avid Minnesota fan?
Yeah, definitely. Always will be. Yeah, for sure.
Wait, what's more likely, aliens existing or a Minnesota team winning a championship in your lifetime?
The evidence. Well, fortunately, I was a year old when the Twins won the World Series, and also, let's not forget about Minnesota women's sports. The men can't do anything, but the women win fairly often. The Lynx have like I think 3 or 4 championships in my lifetime.
Oh, shoot.
So,
Okay.
we definitely have that. But yeah, I mean, you raise a good point though, that the evidence of aliens existing has been about on par with the evidence that a men's Minnesota sports team can win a championship over the course of the last 30 years. So, I don't know. We'll see what happens first.
All right. I appreciate it, Tom. Do you have any final thoughts?
Um, I don't think so. Yeah, it's just been a real pleasure to join you and to be able to talk a bit with you. And so yeah, thanks again a lot for having me on.
Yeah, give me 1 second here. Okay. We are gonna